Welcome to today's program titled Disaster Recovery and Employee Safety. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials along with the CLE attendance form will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Adam Young. Adam, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Young. I'm a partner with Seyfarth Chicago office. I'm a member of our firm's Workplace Safety Environmental Group, as are two of my colleagues here today, Mr. Scott Hecker and Ms. Melissa Ortega. They'll introduce themselves when we get to their portions of this presentation. Mr. Hecker is from our Washington, D.C. office and has a really unique perspective on occupational safety and health law, given his background with the United States Department of Labor. And Melissa Ortega is an associate here in Chicago at the office that I work from. I specialize in occupational safety and health law. We do have members with that specialization in 6 different offices around the United States. So we have a very wide platform and we're able to provide comprehensive services in occupational safety and health counseling and litigation to clients. I think what's unique about our group is that we try cases. We go to trials on OSHA citations, so we're thinking about the end game of any legal issue, from the outset when we're providing advice on it. Let's go on to the next slide, please. The information we're providing, today is for you all. The program is being recorded. It's going to be placed on YouTube. So if you felt like you missed something or you want to refer this presentation to others to review, you're going to have the opportunity to do that. The slide deck is going to be publicly available as well. So if you want the slide deck, feel free to email me, Scott, or Melissa. We're happy to provide it to you. The slides are really just a starting point for our discussion today. We're not going to be reading slides, mostly because that's very boring. And we're going to be providing answers to a lot of the burning questions we're hearing. If you do have any questions, feel free to write them into the chat feature, and we're happy to get those answered. If the question's not for you, you're just asking for a friend, that's fine too. We're happy to get those addressed. We've reserved significant time at the end of our presentation today to answer those questions that everyone has. So please feel free to jump in anytime. So what are we talking about here today? Devastation from hurricanes, OSHA liability generally, what is required of employers? How does OSHA view those work sites? Down in Florida, down in areas hit by natural disasters. I tend to look at emergency preparedness and disaster response as two sides of the same coin, because a lot of the same analyses, a lot of the same programs and procedures have to be developed for responding to this disaster and getting ready for the next one. So we're going to be talking about doing job hazard analyses or job hazard assessments. That's going to be about a site-specific safety analysis and how that plays into the OSHA requirements. Employers do need to figure out what the hazards are, right, and what they need to do to protect employees. And we'll talk about that as well. Employees who are down there working already, what are the requirements for them? And particularly that multi-employer worksite context. We'll be talking about contractors, specialized third parties that are working for you all, staffing agency employees, temps. What needs to be done to protect your company from legal liabilities related to those individuals. And then finally, we're going to be talking about if OSHA shows up, right? We have a very active federal OSHA agency. If you report an injury, it's a good chance OSHA's coming. So what do you do? How do you prepare for an OSHA on-site inspection? All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. All right, we have, unfortunately, another hurricane season that has been absolutely devastating for the people of Florida and other areas of the United States. We've seen tremendous population growth in the Sun Belt and economic development, particularly in some of the smaller coastal cities. So we've seen greater exposure from our clients to these types of disasters, And of course, climatologists are telling us that there's severe hurricanes that are going on, there's tornadoes, and more of them are expected due to changing temperatures. It's important time to raise these issues, to talk about how occupational safety and health are affected, and what type of disaster response we might see from the agency and what's needed by our clients. Hurricane Ian has caused $67 billion of damage and physical damage, so we're anticipating huge rebuilding efforts, remediation of hazards, and each of those efforts is going to expose a lot of individuals to occupational safety and health issues going forward. Federal OSHA, it's part of the United States Department of Labor, that enforces occupational safety and health standards as to private employers in 27 of the states. Federal OSHA applies to private employers in Florida. Some states have their own OSHA state plans that enforce standards as well. Relevant here, for example, is South Carolina and the Territory of Puerto Rico. Both have their own state agencies that largely apply the federal standards. All right, so let's go on to the next slide, please. Federal OSHA regulations. There's one set of regulations that apply to general industry, so most work sites. There's another set that apply to construction work sites. Just general industry work sites, there's more than 30,000 regulations that apply to you if you're an employer with a general industry work site. And even if you comply with all 30,000 of those regulations, the agency may come in and say you're violating the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And that's because the Act has a general duty clause too. Employers are required to provide a workplace that's free from any recognized hazard that could cause substantial injury or death. So there are going to be a lot of recognized hazards out at these work sites. How are they being addressed? Is the employer taking sufficient abatements to address those? That's the kind of analysis that OSHA is going to be doing. And we'll talk in more detail about those types of hazards specifically. Federal OSHA now has a much stronger agenda, more of a driven agency. For much of the Trump administration, we had essentially a leaderless agency. There was no Undersecretary of Labor on top, leading OSHA. In the Biden administration, we have Doug Parker, who's was confirmed as the head of federal OSHA. He formerly came from California OSHA. And for those of you who've worked in the field, California OSHA is extremely aggressive. It has a lot of efforts to have new standards, to be at the cutting edge of enforcement. And we've seen a lot of that culture carry over to federal OSHA, concern with writing new standards, concern with protecting temporary employees, non-English speaking employees. Those have all been big efforts from the agency. We attended a meeting with Mr. Parker back in March of this year, and we heard about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how important that was to the Department of Labor and OSHA enforcement. So here we're talking about devastation in an area that's very diverse, a state that's very diverse. We're going to have a lot of construction contractors coming in from other states, a very diverse workforce. We anticipate that OSHA is going to be particularly sensitive towards those issues and protecting those employees. So we anticipate the area offices in these areas to be very active. And in the past, with past disasters, OSHA has sent in more enforcement compliance officers from other states to try to add a larger force to enforce the occupational safety and health standards there. All right, so OSHA liability, people used to think about OSHA liability as it just applied to your own employees. Not true. It doesn't just apply to your own employees. You as an employer could be liable for a range of different folks who are out at your work sites. If we go on to the next slide, please. OSHA since 1999 has applied a multi-employer worksite doctrine. So each employer could be responsible for the safety and health of any employee who's out there. They look at the issue towards which employer created the hazard, which employer exposed employees to the hazard, who's the exposing employer, who's responsible for correcting the hazard, and who's the controlling employer at the work site. A lot of different employers OSHA sees as controlling. So general contractors, they say you could be the controlling employer because you're bringing in third-party contractors. Host employer, so you own the facility or you manage the facility. You could be liable for OSHA violations relating to third parties that come out there. I had a case set for trial this week that got bumped a few months, but it concerns a fatal fall where an employee was a salesperson who came onto a work site and he climbed up an extension ladder, walked around on an interior roof and fell through a roof tile and unfortunately later passed away. And OSHA, the OSHA agency at issue in that state, they came on site, they did an inspection, and they cited 4 different employers. They cited the property owner, they cited the property manager, uh, they cited the employer of the salesperson, and they cited the employer of another consultant who happened to be there as well. And each of them were cited for serious violations relating to fall protection and not having guardrails or fall protection in place. So OSHA sees the work site as a very broad, comprehensive view. They're going to be looking at all these different types of employees. They're going to be looking at you potentially if you're an employer and you have any involvement with a work site, and you need to be conscious of that and address that potential liability. If we go on to the next slide, please. Liabilities in OSHA, there's civil liabilities for citations. A serious is now $14,000 and change. A repeat or willful could be 5 or 10 times that. We do see multi-million-dollar OSHA citations, and those typically result from allegations that an employer has been willful egregious, and there's been some sort of violation by violation penalties for those. There's also criminal liability related to OSHA. If there is a willful and it results in a fatality, and it's a violation of a specific OSHA regulation, not the general duty clause, there's a potential for criminal prosecutions of company owners, of of company safety professionals that could spend up to 6 months in jail. So big deal. Multi-employer work sites, each of these different types of employees could potentially be the basis for an OSHA citation. So what are the critical issues here? What does your contract say? If you're bringing in a third-party specialty contractor to do work in their area of specialization, what does your contract say? Does it say that they need to comply with OSHA? We have a writer, we're happy to provide you. They'll explain if you're doing a project down in Southwest Florida, what duties are being met by those third-party contractors you're bringing on site. Very important as to who's exercising control over the means and methods of that work, right? If you're relying on a third-party contractor, you're not going to be liable for their OSHA violations if that reliance is reasonable. If you're there directing the work and telling them what they need to do, how they need to do it, you're more likely to be liable for OSHA violations. But we always note imminent dangers, right? Anyone is potentially liable for an imminent danger they're aware of, and we want to make sure that no one gets injured out at a work site. So if you're there, your manager sees an imminent danger, tell the person to get down from the height where they don't have fall protection. Tell them to get out of the trench. Make sure that we're addressing any imminent dangers immediately so that no one is injured in any way. Let's go. Oh, I guess I would add here, if there are temps being used at a work site, OSHA procedures say they immediately have to do an investigation into that. So they're very sensitive towards staffing agency type relationships or the use of temporary employees, and they automatically open investigations and inspections into those. So we want to make sure we're in full compliance, particularly with regard to some folks who are working for temp employers. All this is taking place, this disaster and this recovery, in a unique environment from the employment perspective. We have a very low unemployment rate. We have people who are new at certain fields. We might have someone who just started roofing 4 weeks ago, has never worked in the industry before. So there's a lot of additional issues that are going to be raised with regard to training, with regard to OSHA liabilities for temp employees. Are we reasonably relying on those third-party contractors? So all important issues we need to be thinking about. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so how do you know what hazards are facing your employees? The most important thing you can do to evaluate that, the hazards to your employees and hazards at your work site, is doing a JHA or job hazard analysis. This is part of what safety professionals are trained to do. That's determining what hazards are out there. How are you going to address them? Is there a way to address them in a way that employees will either not be exposed to the hazard or the hazard will be brought down to a reasonable level in terms of risk. Let's go on to the next slide. This goes through the hierarchy of safety controls, and this would be you do the job hazard analysis, and safety professionals look at this in terms of how they're going to address hazards. So the best thing you could do would be at the top, right? Eliminate the hazard entirely. Substitution, for example, would be something like substituting chemicals. Could you substitute the hazardous chemical for a non-hazardous chemical and be able to accomplish the same goal? Engineering controls would be, things like putting covers on things or guards, using a different piece of equipment that doesn't create the same hazard. Maybe that's a form of substitution as well. And then administrative controls are training people, adopting procedures to protect individuals. And then last would be personal protective equipment. So that would be having the hazard in place. For example, with silica, you could either stop doing the tasks that put silica into the air. You could have engineering controls like water-based saws to keep the silica dust down. You could have administrative controls telling people how to use them in ways that are safer and create less silica. And then finally, PPE, you could have a respiratory protection program in place to protect employees from the silica that's exposed in the air. But the preference is to eliminate to the extent you can. Let's go on to the next slide, and I'll turn things over to Mr. Hecker.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. As Adam mentioned, I'm a senior counsel in our DC office. I did spend about a dozen years at DOL, the Department of Labor, approximately the last 5 of which I was in the Occupational Safety and Health Division of the Solicitor's Office. So OSHA was my client. And I've worked with a number of the people that we continue to deal with and work with on a daily basis in our practice. On this slide, you'll just see a number of the hazards that you may be exposed to in a disaster recovery effort. And I think circling back to one of Adam's points, the job hazard analysis is really important here, particularly in this context where you may have people working and dealing with hazards that are unanticipated or they're not dealing with on a daily basis, and they could be specific to the hazard response and the hazard circumstance that people find themselves in after one of these kinds of storms, a hurricane, another disaster, where you're dealing with chemicals that you may not have dealt with previously, or resulting from sort of decay processes that can cause irritation, can cause respiratory issues. You have biological pathogens, mold, fungus. I'm going to circle back with Adam later about mold because he really enjoys talking about it. Biological, I'm sorry, I said biological. Atmospheric, you have airborne toxins, lower oxygen levels. You might find that in a confined space circumstance in a recovery effort. You've got physical issues, obviously, debris, things shaken loose, structural, where buildings have, collapsed, roofs are unsafe, and then electrical equipment. Of course, you may have down power lines, other issues with electrical if you're working around water. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see, some additional issues you may need to deal with here, such as working in those wet conditions, which can exacerbate electrical issues. Working near or over water, you could wind up certainly in a fall protection situation, and combining that with other hazards like electrical. These are all things that you're going to see potentially in these disaster areas. One, that we have there, working near loud noise may not be something that people pay a ton of attention to. It may not be the most glamorous of violations, but OSHA does have regs covering the level of noise that folks can be exposed to. You're in a disaster recovery situation. You could be working with generators, compressors, other noisy equipment that's involved in these recovery efforts, these response and recovery efforts, and those can be loud. And you may not be thinking first and foremost about the noise levels, but if you take precautions, mitigation efforts, you should be able to reduce your risk of OSHA enforcement issues around that area. You want to keep folks out of the way of noisy equipment when they don't need to be in that area. You can move the equipment to more isolated areas. You want to noise monitor to make sure that levels aren't above 90 decibels. Use hearing protection if you're going to be around those potential noise sources. And OSHA has provided a rule of thumb suggesting if you can't have a conversation within arm's length, about 3 feet from someone, and we're all more familiar now with social distancing than we were 3 years ago. But if you can't speak to someone within 3 feet, the noise level could be at that 90 decibel level. So you'll want to sort of take the appropriate steps. You may need to implement a hearing conservation program if you're exceeding the permissible levels. But that's something that you may not initially think about. You'll see that slide there, and you can review some of those OSHA resources. OSHA also has an e-tool on disaster recovery that has a lot of useful information. So there's plenty of guidance out there, not only obviously to deal with compliance issues, but certainly in the first instance to keep your employees safe in these new and difficult environments. If we could go to the next slide, go back and dive a little more into the JHA process. Again, it's incredibly important to do this at any work site, but particularly where you're dealing with sort of the dynamic circumstances surrounding disaster recovery and response. You'll want to identify through the JHA the appropriate PPE, personal protective, and other preventative measures you can take to keep employees safe when they may be exposed to these kinds of hazards that we've been talking about throughout the presentation. And also understand the responses necessary to address these exposures, when they happen, keeping in mind the hierarchy controls that Adam talked about. But for example, if you're dealing with contaminated floodwaters, the hazards could be bacterial. They could be infectious organisms from sewage in the water or soil where you're working, toxic substances from flooded industrial waste sites. Again, back to that idea of mold and fungus in the air. And there are steps to take to address those kinds of things and keep your employees safe. You ventilate those areas with fresh air when you can. Act as if the floodwaters are contaminated unless you know otherwise. Treat it in a proactive way, not a reactive way, to take the precautions that you need to take. Make sure you have trained workers in these areas, that they understand the PPE they need to use if they're dealing with toxic chemicals or other hazardous waste or mold. Make sure you're up to date with things like your tetanus shot. That's something that folks in these circumstances where they're being exposed to certain materials that are potentially hazardous, it's good to sort of be up to date on those kinds of vaccines or tetanus shots. Get rid of stuff that's water damaged or visibly contaminated that could have these dangerous agents. Again, we talked about proper PPE, but particular to working around floodwaters, waterproof boots, gloves, other protective clothing that may be chemical resistant, outer clothing that you could use in those circumstances, protective eyewear. And we'll dig in a little bit more on some of these as well. You may need to use the N95 disposable respirator if you're handling, in particular, mold contaminated materials, or there may be greater respiratory protection needs that you need to employ. Again, going back to that JHA, these are the kinds of things you would identify in that first evaluation. And you'll want to keep an adequate supply of clean water available for drinking and washing hands. You need clean or disinfected water to make sure you're keeping folks clean and able to, pursue appropriate hygiene processes. Again, we have another sort of matrix here that is provided by OSHA that gives you a lot of ideas on how to respond to these kinds of things and address them both proactively and reactively, front end and back end. If we could go to the next slide. We were continue sort of talking about those floodwaters, but obviously they can contain a lot of potentially hazardous chemicals, even organic materials, other pathogens in those floodwaters. And again, treating it as if there is an issue rather than waiting to find out if something's contaminated. Just like you might in a downed electrical line, you don't approach that until you know the circumstances. Deal with the floodwaters in a way that suggests that assumes that they are already contaminated, and you want to approach that in a way You'll see there ungloved hands shouldn't make contact with contaminated floodwaters. Some of these circumstances, unfortunately and tragically, folks may be encountering human remains. I would suggest you may want to take a step of calling the appropriate authorities initially, but workers who are involved in these kinds of recovery efforts that may handle human remains, they're susceptible to certain things like bloodborne viruses, hepatitis, HIV, and bacteria that can cause disease. So it's extremely important to wear protective gloves, particularly when you're handling human or animal remains. With the gloves, you want to, as we note there, use this combination if you can. Nothing's perfect. So if you wind up suffering a puncture wound, you're going to want to remove the contaminated gloves, wash that area with soap, clean or disinfected water, as we said, or an alcohol-based hand cleaner. Again, we're all very familiar with alcohol-based hand sanitizer at this point. And if there's contamination or if the wound sort of further develops, you're going to want to seek medical attention, of course. Folks should be directed not to touch their face with contaminated gloves. That sort of hand-to-mouth contact can be a real avenue for disease spread. Be careful removing those gloves after you use them. You want to remove them carefully so you're not actually contaminating your hands, that you would just use the gloves to protect. Discard them appropriately. If you're using reusable gloves, make sure they're the inner washable gloves are disinfected appropriately. And again, we mentioned washing hands. That one is always a baseline important activity to take to protect yourself in these kinds of circumstances. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about eye protection. There can be a number of issues around with your eyes, and at bottom line, wearing goggles, wearing sort of face shields, vented goggles to protect yourself from splash hazards or other things like if you're in compromised structures or around collapsed buildings. There could be dust, concrete, metal particles in the air. There could be shifting or falling debris, smoke, other noxious or poisonous gases that may require, again, respiratory protection there, along with the eye protection. We could be working with chemicals, working around chemicals, dealing with cutting or welding. There could be hazards associated with fires or heat. And again, we've just mentioned on the prior slide, bloodborne pathogens like hepatitis or HIV from blood or bodily fluids or human remains. Again, all these things can lead to certain eye injuries that you want to protect against, corneal abrasions, conjunctivitis, chemical splashes or burns, eyeball laceration, facial contusions, black eyes, all these kinds of things that you want to, avoid as best you can. And circling back to that JHA, before you select the appropriate eye protection, you're going to want to deal with, you're going to do that JHA to determine what those conditions and hazards are and what is appropriate. At minimum, it may be safety glasses with side protection. But again, you could use all the way up to a full face piece respirator. If there's a particular welding circumstance, you'll want to use a welding helmet, goggles, and other welding respirator, welding PPE appropriate material. And keep folks out of the way when these kinds of things are going on. If there is sort of welding activity or other activity where, could lead to splash or other eye injury, keep folks out of the way. Just have the need to participate recovery employees in the areas where these exposures may happen. You don't need extra people standing around lingering at the work site, the recovery and response site. We go to the next slide. And Adam spoke already about his fall case, but in these circumstances, we just talked about compromised structures. You may have uneven or structurally unsound walking or working surfaces. You may have folks working at height on rooftops, over water, in aerial buckets. These kinds of things all need to be considered and determine. You need to determine what kind of fall protection is appropriate. We talked about how you could see electrocution circumstances there if you're walking around water and down power lines. And folks should be protected in that way. When they're working around water, you're going to want to have something like a personal flotation device or life belt available. Take other precautions that you make sure folks are appropriately trained to be in these circumstances. And that all goes back to kind of, again, the job hazard analysis and what you think folks are going to be exposed to, how they are going to, how you are going to address those circumstances proactively and evaluate the risks that your folks are likely to face. If we go to the next slide. Again, we talked a little bit about respiratory protection, but there's certainly the potential for hazardous atmospheres in these kinds of rescue and recovery operations. You are going to want to potentially monitor air if you feel like there's the potential for exposure there, particularly if you're winding up, going into enclosed or confined spaces that may not be ventilated as well. Portable generators really should be used outdoors. You'll need to take appropriate activities, preventative measures if they're going to be used indoors, but I think we would recommend, and I think OSHA would recommend, generally using them outdoors. Respiratory protection, there is an entire standard sort of dedicated to respiratory protection programs, and when they're necessary, you'll need to go through medical evaluations to make sure employees can handle the type of respirator you're employing to protect them, and you'll need to make sure those fit appropriately and go through fit tests as well. We were talking just before this presentation about a bridge lead remediation project that's the subject of sort of a venerable OSHA OSHRC Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission case where the company was sandblasting lead paint off a bridge. OSHA showed up. There wasn't appropriate respiratory protection used by all of the employees on site. I think there were 35 employees or so with this contractor. OSHA determined that this was an egregious violation. They determined that this employer was flouting the OSH Act and decided to go with separate violation by violation penalties, which is not typically how OSHA approaches things. But if they find something to be egregious, they're going to issue kind of individual penalties for each violation. So each employee, that wasn't wearing the protection is subject to that violation. And that resulted in penalties over $1 million. I think 1.3 million initially proposed by OSHA. And OSHA moved forward with, in conjunction with its sister agency, DOJ, to pursue criminal action. And so that liability, as Adam referred to earlier, is out there. And so you need to make sure that you're following these appropriate steps to avoid those kinds of issues at your work sites and when you're involved in these sort of remediation activities. If we go to the next slide, just other physical hazards. We had talked about the various kinds of hazards. We have addressed some of the chemical, biological, other hazards. Physical hazards, again, you could see debris, things like that. Damage to buildings, again, we talked about unstable buildings or roofs, down to electrical lines, of course. When you're restoring power to your electrical equipment at your work sites, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking steps to properly control that power, mitigate risk when something's coming back online so that you can avoid sort of a surprise or improper operation of that activity where someone, it's re-energizing. You should engage things like switch gears, interlocks, presence sensing devices to ensure there isn't that kind of quick start that folks weren't ready for. And again, of course, we have the picture of a chainsaw there. You're going to want to take appropriate action when using something like a chainsaw, other blade-based devices, as much as you can guard and, wear safety protection gloves. Again, you're going to likely want eye gear there too. All of those things are, potential issues. The other thing, restoring electrical power, when it comes to utilities, those kinds of activities could certainly implicate working with or around electrical lines, aerial lifts, so you deal with fall protection. There may be confined space issues, so you're talking about air monitoring. There could be trenching concerns if down power lines are in trenches or other excavated areas, tree trimming and removal. work over near water. These are just some of the hazards you could face in these circumstances where utilities may be down for an extended period, and when you're trying to get them back up, how you go about doing that safely. If we could go to the next slide. We just wanted to address some additional hazards. Heat illness is a big focus for OSHA at the moment. There have been some other state agencies who have gotten into this space, and OSHA has talked about doing a heat illness standard. So, you want to have available, we talked about water, but make sure if you're in hot conditions, ice, electrolytes, cooling stations, allowing for additional breaks, having the right amount of, an appropriate amount of water on hand for drinking and for, appropriate hand washing, other hygiene efforts. Make sure you have toilets available. Again, wash stations, the hand hygiene is super important. You could face a lot of standing water. You're working around floodwaters, mosquitoes or other insect-borne illness. Even just folks being allergic, you may wind up in a situation where there's greater exposure in these kinds of circumstances. One that's not listed here, but of course, we'd be remiss to not mention in this pandemic age, is COVID. You may have folks working in tight or temporary quarters or working conditions, so you should take care, particularly in geographic areas with high transmission rates, to mitigate those risks, the COVID risks, as needed. Again, evaluating the risks for your particular recovery site. And that's true of any transmissible disease. You really want to consider what hazards are out there, and again, what preventative measures you can take. Adam, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here and chat about mold a little bit more, or workplace violence that we may see in these circumstances.
Sure. Yeah. Mold is a huge issue. It's been a huge subject of litigation in Florida specifically because of the humid climate. There may be more risks of mold development. And we get a lot of questions from clients about what to do about mold. They see mold on the wall. Employees are complaining about mold. And I think it's one of the most heavily misunderstood topics we deal with in safety and health. Mold is all around us. It's in the air. There's no OELs or occupational exposure limits. There's no PELs, permissible exposure limits for mold levels from OSHA. So doing airborne testing for mold is normally not helpful at all. It doesn't tell us anything other than what we already knew, that mold's available in the air. So the most important thing when addressing mold is stopping the source of water intrusion. And the second most important thing is bringing in that third-party contractor who knows how to do cleanup work, and that they can clean up using the right chemicals, bleach or whatever it is, to get mold off the walls. Thanks, Scott. I do love mold or hate mold, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about that.
For sure. And we had also mentioned, in preparing for this, the potential for workplace violence. That is another area, specifically in the healthcare sector, that OSHA has focused on. But they do have guidance in other areas like late night retail. And you could, with folks being displaced, frustrated, tempers high, emotions high, that's something to consider too. What workplace violence preventative measures you may want to take, particularly in these kinds of difficult and, again, dynamic circumstances. I think with that, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Ortega. I'm an associate in the Chicago office in the Workplace Safety Group. As Adam mentioned earlier, we have a diverse and experienced group of attorneys here, so please feel free to reach out to me or anyone else in the group with any occupational safety and health related questions. Before we move on to the substance, I'm going to read out the CLE code for anybody who would like CLE credit. That CLE code is SS 6588. Again, that's SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 6588. All right, moving on. So employers are generally required to train their employees under these circumstances. So that could include any of the following, any new hazards in the worksite as a result of recovery efforts. To name a few, and I know Scott and Adam already touched on these, heat exposure. So for example, if the AC is now down at the worksite, there may be a risk for heat illness that is new to employees. We also should be training on electric work practices training, hazard communication training for any new chemicals that employees may be exposed to, and similarly, blood-borne pathogens that Scott mentioned earlier. Adam also mentioned earlier the job hazard analysis. Employers should train on any new hazards that are found as a result of any job hazard analysis. We should also be training on why, when, and how to use PPE. An example of that would be respirators that Scott mentioned. I know we've all used N95 masks now into year 3 of the pandemic, and we think it should be counterintuitive, but OSHA does require employers to train on the proper use of respirators. So if your company is now finding that it will need to require the use of respirator due to some new hazard in the workplace, employers should make sure to train employers on the proper use. And that's in addition to the fit testing and medical evaluation Scott mentioned earlier. Employers must also train on any emergency action plans that it develops, and we'll talk about this in a later slide. OSHA also requires that employers provide training using both a language and a vocabulary that employees can understand. OSHA does instruct its compliance officers to verify that employees can understand the training that is provided to them. So again, it's important to make sure that your employees are trained in a language they understand. Our group does help employers review and develop safety trainings, including in Spanish. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Next slide, please, Catherine. Generally, employers are required to conduct exposure monitoring of certain toxic chemicals or substances and harmful physical agents. So under OSHA standards, employers must preserve and maintain any medical and exposure records for each employee, inform employees of the existence, location, and availability of those records as well. Additionally, employers must give access to those records under the OSHA standards whenever an employee or an employee representative requests that information. And employers must provide that access within 15 working days of the request. It's also important to keep in mind the obligations under the ADA. So if an employer receives a request for an accommodation, you can reach out to us or other counsel to ensure that we're complying with the ADA. Some requests may include a request for frequent or extended breaks, time off, or additional voluntary PPE. Just keep in mind that there are some OSHA requirements for certain PPE, even if the use is voluntary. Next slide, please, Catherine. One thing employers should make sure is that first aid kits are available because there may be an increased risk of infection or other hazards. Employers should confirm emergency responder availability. We should confirm that there are first aid supplies in abundance on the work site. OSHA does recommend that every workplace include at least one or more employees who are trained and certified in first aid, including CPR. So those employees must receive training regarding the hazards to which they may be exposed to during any response. So additional first aid training may be necessary to address any new hazards in the workplace. First aid responders who may be exposed to potentially infectious materials must also be trained and equipped under the OSHA standards. Employers must also develop written exposure control plans and must provide employee training at the time of the initial assignment or and annually thereafter. Next slide, please. So OSHA standards also require that workplaces with more than 10 employees develop a written emergency action plan, and that is to identify and coordinate necessary employer and employee actions during an emergency. At a minimum, there are some requirements that must go into the emergency action plan, and there are some recommended elements as well. At a minimum, the action plan must include means of reporting emergencies, evacuation procedures, and assigned exit routes, procedures to account for all employees following an evacuation, procedures to be followed by employees who must remain behind to attend to critical plant operations before any evacuation, rescue and or medical duties for employees who are assigned and trained to perform them, and names or job titles of people who can be contacted for more information about the plan. There are additional recommended elements that employers should consider, and that includes the location of the nearest hospital or emergency medical center, the type of alarm system used to notify employees of an emergency, procedures for protecting information, and that includes procedures for storing or maintaining critical documents and records, the location and permissible uses of protective equipment, such as portable defibrillators, first aid kits, dust masks, and fire extinguishers, etc. And lastly, the location of televisions or radios for further information during a disaster. As mentioned earlier, employers must also train employees to understand their roles and responsibilities under the plan, and that training must be documented. Next slide, please. All right, moving on to whistleblower retaliation complaints. So whistleblower retaliation complaints are common and they're handled by OSHA. Under the Act, an employer may not discharge or retaliate against an employee in any way because the employee instituted any proceeding under or related to the Act. So this includes raising any safety or health-related concerns, asking any questions, requesting safety and health-related documents, or reporting work-related illnesses or injuries. There are various acts that are covered and may be implicated in a whistleblower complaint under these circumstances. So a few that can come up now during this time for employers recovering after the hurricanes are the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Solid Waste Disposal Act, the Surface Transportation Assistance Act, and of course, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The time frame or the statute of limitations for which an employee who alleges retaliation under the different acts varies act by act. It can be anywhere within 30 days to 180 days, but on average, an employee must file a complaint with OSHA within 30 days of the alleged unfavorable employment action. Moving on to refusals to work, employees generally may not just walk off the job because of a potential unsafe condition at the workplace. OSHA does expressly instruct employees to approach their employer first when they believe that working conditions are unsafe or unhealthy. However, if the condition clearly presents a serious risk of death or serious physical harm, and there's not sufficient time for OSHA to inspect, the worker may have a legal right to refuse work in a situation in which they would be exposed to the hazard. So if you have a situation where an employee is refusing to work because of a hurricane-related danger, it's you should probably check with your legal counsel before taking any disciplinary action, because this can lead to a whistleblower retaliation complaint. Next slide, please. All right, so after the dust settles and employees are returning to work, either to business as usual or to help in recovery and cleanup efforts, OSHA has been known to send out its compliance officers following a devastating environmental event, like Hurricane Harvey in the past. So if OSHA comes knocking on your door, it's important to keep the following in mind. Once management or council have been alerted, it's important to determine and control the scope of the inspection. There are 3 types of OSHA inspections. The first is following a fatality or a catastrophe. The second is following an employee complaint. And the third is a programmed inspection. There's something called a plain view doctrine. So during the walk-around portion of the inspection, it's important to keep this doctrine in mind because employers can and will issue citations for any violations that are in plain view. So a good mantra to keep in mind is if they can't see it, they can't cite you for it. It's also important that management or the employer representative does not make any admissions. So we typically recommend that whoever is managing an inspection for the employer be cooperative, but we also highlight to never admit to a violation or that the company does not have something that is being requested. It's okay to say, we'll get back to you on that. And that concludes that portion. I'm going to turn it over to Adam to speak about preserving the attorney-client's privilege.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Happy to talk again, Melissa. So attorney-client privilege, obviously a very important thing to make sure you preserve. We have an article on careful communications, and that's really important for everyone, right? What we don't want is people sending out a bunch of emails, admitting to things that aren't true, making untruthful statements, because those could be seized upon either by OSHA and other forms of litigation. So we recommend you have a careful communications policy. We recommend, if you do attorney-client privilege communications, include attorneys in those communications, mark them attorney-client privilege, much less likely it's going to be challenged and never come up in court again. The key there, in most states' law is that you have to limit that to the control group. So you can't waive the privilege by sending out to third parties. You can't include people who are not those folks in the control group. So hourly, non-supervisory employees, because you may waive the privilege as well. If you have a serious accident or fatality, get a lawyer involved. It could be in-house counsel. It could be us. Do your accident report, your incident investigation under attorney-client privilege. You can be a little bit more comprehensive in what goes in there, and theories that are being run down. Leave that in draft form, and it won't have to be turned over in an OSHA inspection. All right, let's go on to the next slide. All right, thank you all so much for joining us. I don't see Q&A issues that we haven't addressed. If you go to the next slide, please. Feel free to email any of us. We're happy to provide this presentation, provide more information. If you have any safety or health issue, I bet we have an article that specifically addresses it. So feel free to reach out to us. Scott or Melissa, do you guys have any other comments before we jump off? Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, if we don't have the article, Adam, we'll write it. So certainly chime in on that front. And just to circle back on the whistleblower issue, not to go off topic, but OSHA, and I think Melissa alluded to this, has responsibility for far more than just the OSHA Act. You mentioned a couple others, but even Sarbanes-Oxley whistleblower investigations are under OSHA's jurisdiction. So it's got a broad reach when it comes to that. For whatever reason, that's where whistleblower protection programs have landed. But we have experience in those areas. I'm handling a STA case right now. So, we're here for that and any of your other workplace safety and health issues.